The needle was already in my arm before anyone asked if I agreed to this. I sat in a leather chair that cost more than my yearly wage, my sleeve pushed up by a nurse who would not meet my eyes, while 6 people I had served for 3 years stood around me like I was a stranger who had broken into their home. My name is Grace Whitfield. I clean the floors of the Voss estate. I cook the meals. I fold the shirts of men who could end my life with a phone call. And on that morning, I was told to give my blood so they could prove I was a liar. Margaret Voss stood closest to me, her arms crossed, her rings catching the light every time she moved her hands, which she did constantly, like she needed the motion to keep her rage contained. She was the mother of the man this family called Don, though I had never once called him that to his face. To me, he was simply Damien, a man who barely spoke to me beyond instructions about dinner times and grocery lists. A man whose house I kept spotless, while my own life fell into a kind of quiet nothing. "You will sit there, and you will let the doctor finish," Margaret said, though I had not tried to move. "And when this is done, you will pack your things." I did not answer her. I had learned in 3 years that answering Margaret Voss only gave her more reasons to speak. The nurse withdrew the needle and pressed a small piece of cotton against my skin, taping it down with hands that trembled slightly. She was afraid too. Everyone in this house was afraid of something, and I had spent 3 years learning to hide my own fear so well that most days I forgot it was there at all. "I want to know," Margaret continued, turning to the small crowd of men behind her, lawyers and advisors whose names I had learned only because I served them coffee, "how a housekeeper believes she can trap a man like my son. Did you think we would not notice? Did you think we were fools?" "I never said the child was his," I said quietly. It was the first thing I had spoken since they called me into this room an hour ago. "Then why?" Margaret snapped, stepping closer. "Are you carrying one at all?" I looked past her, toward the window, toward the long driveway lined with trees that I had walked 100 times with grocery bags in my arms. I did not answer that question either, because the answer was not mine to give in a room full of strangers who had already decided what they believed. Damien stood by the door the entire time. He had not moved since the moment I was brought in. He had not spoken a single word since his mother started talking, though I could feel him watching me, the way you feel heat from a fire even with your back turned. I refused to look at him. I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much this was breaking something inside me that I had built carefully over years, brick by brick, the wall that let me survive in this house without losing myself entirely. "The results will be ready in 3 days," the doctor said, packing his equipment into a black case, with the kind of efficiency that told me he had done this before, in this house, for other reasons I did not want to imagine. "We will contact the family directly." "Good," Margaret said, "and until then, she stays in the guest wing. Not her usual room. I do not want her near the kitchen, near the children when they visit, near anything that belongs to this family." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it, being treated as a criminal in a house where I had spent 3 years making sure everyone else was comfortable, was almost too much to hold inside my chest, without some kind of reaction escaping. "Understood," I said instead, my voice flat and calm, because calm was the only weapon I had left in a room full of people with real ones. They walked me down the hall like I was under guard, though no one touched me, no one needed to. The house itself felt like a cage now. Familiar hallways turned unfamiliar, portraits of Voss ancestors staring down at me like judges in a trial I never agreed to attend. I passed the kitchen where I had cooked breakfast that very morning, the smell of coffee still faintly in the air, and felt something twist painfully in my stomach that had nothing to do with the child growing inside me. The guest wing was cold, in a way the rest of the house never was. I sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed, in a room with someone else's taste and curtains, and finally let myself breathe. 3 years ago, I came to this house with nothing but a suitcase and a letter of recommendation from a family friend who knew the Voss family needed help after their previous housekeeper retired. My parents had died within 8 months of each other, my father from a heart that gave out too soon, my mother from a grief that ate away at whatever was left of her. I had no siblings, no husband, no children back then, only a small apartment I could no longer afford, and a resume that listed exactly one useful skill: I knew how to make a house run without anyone noticing the work behind it. Margaret Voss hired me after a 15-minute interview, in which she asked more questions about my ability to keep secrets than my ability to keep a house. I did not understand then how much that mattered in this family. I understood it now. Damien was different from his mother in almost every way except one. Neither of them ever said more than they had to. In 3 years, he thanked me exactly 4 times, each time so brief I nearly missed it. He noticed things, though, in a way that surprised me. The way I rearranged the flowers in the hallway on Tuesdays, the way I always left a second cup of coffee out in case he came down before his usual hour. Small things. Things a housekeeper does without expecting anyone to see them. 6 months ago, everything changed on a night that still felt unreal every time I let myself remember it. His engagement to Isabel Calloway had just been announced, a match built not on love, but on the fragile peace between 2 organizations that had been at war for longer than I had been alive. I remember serving drinks that night at the celebration dinner, watching Damien sit through toasts and handshakes with a face carved from stone, watching Isabel smile the practiced smile of a woman who understood exactly what kind of marriage this would be. After the guests left, after the house had gone quiet, I found him alone in the study, a glass of untouched liquor in front of him, staring at nothing. I had gone in to collect the last of the dishes. I should have left the moment I saw him there. Instead, I stayed. We did not plan what happened next. I want to be clear about that, even now, even to myself, lying in a cold guest room, waiting for a blood test to decide the rest of my life. It was not calculated. It was 2 people who had spent months quietly noticing each other in a house built on silence, finally letting that silence break for one single night that neither of us spoke about again. In the morning, he left before I woke. We never discussed it. 2 weeks later, his engagement to Isabel Calloway moved forward exactly as planned. The wedding date set, the alliance between the 2 families sealed in every way except the one that mattered to me. I found out about the child a month after that. I told no one. I had already decided I would raise this baby alone, quietly, far from this house, the moment I found the right time to leave without drawing suspicion. I did not want money. I did not want a place in this family. I wanted to disappear with something that was, for the first time in years, entirely mine. I never got the chance. Margaret noticed the changes in my body before I even fully accepted them myself. Mothers who have spent decades managing appearances know how to spot what other people try to hide. She confronted me in the laundry room 3 days ago, her voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the washing machines, accusing me instantly of trying to trap her son, of being no better than every other woman who had ever tried to use a Voss man to climb into money she did not earn. I denied nothing and confirmed nothing. I simply stood there and let her rage wash over me, because there was no version of the truth that would have made that moment easier. Now, I sat in a borrowed room, in a house that no longer felt like mine to move through freely, waiting for a piece of paper to arrive in 3 days and confirm what I already knew. The door opened without a knock. I looked up, expecting Margaret, already bracing for another wave of accusations. Instead, it was Damien. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, his eyes moving over my face like he was searching for something he had lost the right to ask about. He looked older than he had that morning, tired in a way I had never seen on him before, not even during the worst business disputes I had overheard through closed doors. "Grace," he said, and it was strange hearing my name in his voice after a day of being spoken about like I was not in the room at all. I did not answer right away. I studied him instead, this man who had not defended me once in front of his mother, who had let me be dragged to a clinic and stripped of dignity in front of lawyers and advisors, who now stood in my doorway like he had any right to expect softness from me. "You didn't say anything," I finally said. "In that room, you let her talk to me like I was nothing." "I know," he said, and there was no excuse offered after it, no explanation that tried to soften what he had failed to do. Just those 2 words, honest in a way that surprised me. "Then why are you here now?" He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I felt something other than anger settle into the space between us. Not forgiveness, not yet. but something that told me the next 3 days were going to change far more than a single test result ever could. Because in 3 days, he said, his voice low, careful, like he was choosing each word with the weight of everything riding on it, this house is going to change completely. And I needed you to hear from me, before anyone else, that I already know the truth. I felt my breath catch. You know? I've known since the moment my mother told me you were pregnant, he said. I did the math the same night. I just needed everyone else to reach the same number in their own time. I sat in silence, staring at a man who had let me suffer for 3 days over a truth he had already accepted alone. Anger and relief tangled together inside my chest, impossible to separate from each other. Then why let this happen? I asked. Why let your mother drag me into that room like a criminal, if you already knew? Damien's jaw tightened. Because the moment I confirm it myself, without proof, this house falls apart in a different way. My mother will call it manipulation. Isabel's family will call it an insult. I needed the test to come back on its own, with no one able to claim I forced the outcome. So I was a pawn, I said quietly. Even to you. No, he said, and for the first time, something in his voice cracked, just slightly. Just enough for me to hear the man underneath the title everyone in this house had spent years building around him. You were the one thing in this house I never planned for, and that terrifies people far more powerful than my mother. Neither of us spoke for a long moment after that. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set over the estate grounds, painting the long driveway in shades of orange that made the whole property look, for just a moment, like somewhere peaceful, instead of somewhere I had just been humiliated in front of 6 people who wanted me gone. 3 days, I said finally, more to myself than to him. 3 days, he agreed, and then everything changes. I did not know yet how right he was. I did not know that within a week, a peace treaty between 2 dangerous families would be hanging by a single sheet of paper, with my name printed at the top of it, or that people who had never spoken to me directly would begin deciding whether I deserved to live long enough to raise my child at all. I only knew that for the first time since I sat in that chair with a needle in my arm, I did not feel entirely alone. It would not be enough. Not yet. But it was a beginning, and in a house built on silence and secrets, a beginning was more than I had allowed myself to hope for in days. The car that took me to the clinic had blacked out windows, and I understood without being told that this was not for my privacy, but for the families. 2 men I did not recognize sat in the front seat, silent the entire drive, their eyes flicking to the mirror every few minutes to check on me, like I was cargo that might shift out of place. I kept my hands folded in my lap and stared out at the city passing by in strips of gray and gold, and I let my mind wander back to a place I rarely allowed myself to visit anymore, the small apartment I grew up in before everything changed. My mother used to say that houses remember the people who live in them, that walls hold on to laughter and grief, the same way fabric holds on to a smell, long after the person who wore it is gone. I thought about that as the car pulled through the gates of a private medical building, wondering what the Voss estate would remember about me once this was over. Whether it would remember the woman who kept its floors clean for 3 years, or only the scandal that nearly split its family in half. The clinic itself was quiet, in the way that expensive places always are, all soft lighting and softer voices, receptionists who smiled without asking a single real question. I was led to a private room on the 3rd floor, away from other patients, away from anyone who might recognize the name printed on my intake form and understand exactly which family had sent me here. A woman in a white coat introduced herself as Dr. Ellery Marsh. She had kind eyes, the kind that made me want to trust her immediately, though I had learned enough in 3 years working for a family like the Vosses to know that kindness could be bought just as easily as silence. I need you to understand something before we begin, Dr. Marsh said, closing the door behind her with a soft click. This test will be handled with complete discretion. The results go directly to the family's legal counsel and to you. No one else has access until that moment. That's supposed to comfort me, I said, and I heard the exhaustion in my own voice before I even finished the sentence. She studied me for a moment, and something in her expression softened. You've been through a lot today. You have no idea, I said. She did not press further. She simply guided me through the process, explaining each step with a professionalism that made the entire experience feel almost clinical enough to survive. Right up until the moment the needle touched my skin again, and I felt the same cold reminder that my body, my choices, my future, had all been placed under a microscope by people who saw me as a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be considered. While the blood was drawn, my mind drifted, unwilling to stay present in a room that felt more like a courtroom than a doctor's office. I thought about the night that started all of this, replaying it not out of longing, but out of a need to understand how one evening could unravel 3 years of careful, quiet survival. The Voss family celebration had been extravagant, in a way that only families with more money than conscience could manage. Crystal glasses, imported flowers, a string quartet playing softly in the corner of a ballroom I had spent 2 full days preparing. Isabel Calloway had arrived in a gown the color of deep wine, her dark hair pinned in an elegant twist, every inch of her carrying the composure of someone raised to understand that marriage in families like these was never about love, only about survival. I remembered watching Damien greet her at the door, his hand extended, his smile polite and entirely hollow. I remembered thinking, even then, that I had never once seen him smile like that at me, and feeling foolish for noticing the difference at all. What business did a housekeeper have, comparing herself to a woman whose family controlled half the shipping routes on the eastern coast? By midnight, most of the guests had gone, and I moved through the ballroom collecting empty glasses, exhausted from a day that had started before sunrise. I found Damien in the study almost by accident, drawn there by habit more than intention, since collecting the last of the evening's dishes from that room had become part of my nightly routine. He sat alone in near darkness, the only light coming from a small lamp on his desk, a glass of liquor untouched in front of him. I had never seen him look so tired, not from lack of sleep, but from something heavier, the exhaustion of a man who had just agreed to spend the rest of his life bound to an arrangement he never chose for himself. "You should be celebrating," I said, before I could stop myself, surprised at my own boldness. He looked up at me, and for a moment, something in his expression shifted, the careful mask he wore for everyone else in this house slipping just slightly. Should I? I did not answer. I simply began collecting the glasses scattered around the room, giving him the silence he seemed to need. But he spoke again, quieter this time. "Do you know what it's like, Grace, to watch your entire life get decided in a room full of people who call it strategy?" I paused, glass in hand, surprised he even remembered my name outside of the brief instructions he gave me about dinner and errands. "No," I admitted, "but I know what it's like to have no say in anything that happens to you either." Something passed between us in that moment, an understanding that went beyond employer and employee, beyond the walls that were supposed to separate a Voss from the woman who cleaned his floors. We talked for over an hour that night, about nothing important, about books he had read as a child, about the small town I grew up in before my parents passed away. It was the longest conversation we had shared in 3 years, and somewhere in the middle of it, the distance between us that had always felt so absolute began to feel, for the first time, like something that could be crossed. I do not need to explain every detail of what happened after that. I have relived it enough times in the months since to know exactly what it meant to me, even if I never fully understood what it meant to him. What I know is this: for one night, in a house built on silence and calculation, 2 people allowed themselves to be simply human, without titles, without arrangements, without the weight of everything waiting for them outside that room. In the morning, he was gone before I woke, and neither of us spoke of it again. 2 weeks later, his engagement to Isabel Calloway moved forward exactly as planned. The needle came out of my arm, pulling me back into the present, into a clinic room miles away from that night, into a reality where the consequences of that single evening were about to be confirmed with cold, clinical certainty. "You're all set," Dr. Marsh said, pressing a bandage over the small mark left behind. "The results will take 3 days to process fully. I know that must feel like a long time." "You have no idea," I repeated, quieter this time. She hesitated before I stood to leave, glancing toward the door as if checking that no one else could hear what she was about to say. "I've worked with the Voss family for years, Miss Whitfield. I've seen situations like this before, in other powerful families. I'll only say this once, and then I'll never mention it again. However this test comes back, protect yourself. Not just legally, physically. Families like this one do not always handle inconvenient truths with patience. Her words settled into my chest like a stone, heavier than anything Margaret had said to me that morning. I thanked her, though I was not sure what exactly I was thanking her for, and walked out of that clinic with a small bandage on my arm and a warning I could not shake. The car ride back to the estate felt longer than the ride there, though the roads were the same. I stared out the window and thought about Dr. Marsh's warning, turning it over in my mind, trying to understand exactly what kind of danger a simple truth could create in a family whose entire existence depended on the appearance of control. I did not know then how right she was. I did not know that within days, the peace between two powerful families would hang on the results sitting in a lab somewhere in that clinic, or that people I had never even met would begin calculating whether my life was worth more or less than the truth I carried. Back at the estate, I was escorted once again to the guest wing, the same cold, unfamiliar room, waiting for me exactly as I had left it. I sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed myself to cry, not from fear exactly, though fear was certainly part of it, but from the exhaustion of holding myself together for an entire day while everyone around me treated my body and my future as something to be examined, judged, and controlled. A soft knock came at the door sometime after dark. I expected Margaret again, already bracing myself for another wave of accusations. Instead, when I opened the door, I found a young woman I recognized as one of the household staff, carrying a tray of food I had not requested. "Mr. Voss asked me to bring this," she said quietly, glancing nervously down the hallway before stepping inside. "He said you probably haven't eaten." I looked at the tray, simple food, nothing extravagant, exactly the kind of meal I would have made for myself on any ordinary night before all of this began. It was such a small gesture, and yet in the middle of a day built entirely from cruelty and cold calculation, it felt like the first kind thing anyone had offered me since this nightmare started. "Thank you," I said, and the young woman nodded quickly before slipping back out into the hallway, clearly eager not to be seen lingering too long in a room that had become, in the span of a single day, the most dangerous place in the entire house to be associated with. I ate slowly, sitting alone in that borrowed room, and let my mind drift toward the 3 days ahead. 3 days until the results arrived. 3 days until the truth I already knew in my heart became something undeniable on paper, something that would force every person in that house, and eventually every person connected to two powerful families, to face a reality none of them were prepared for. I thought about the child growing inside me, still small, still entirely unaware of the storm gathering around the circumstances of its existence. I placed my hand gently over my stomach and made a quiet promise, the same one I had made to myself the moment I first learned I was pregnant, long before Margaret ever suspected anything at all. Whatever happened in the next 3 days, whatever the results revealed, whatever chaos followed, I would not let this child grow up believing it was ever a mistake, or a weapon, or a pawn in someone else's war. It deserved better than the house I currently sat in, better than the family whose name it might one day carry, and I intended to make sure it received exactly that, no matter what it cost me. Outside, the estate grounds fell into darkness, the long driveway I had walked so many times, now hidden beneath a moonless sky. Somewhere in that same house, Damien sat awake as well, I was certain of it, carrying his own version of the same fear I carried, though neither of us would speak of it openly again until the results finally arrived. 3 days. I closed my eyes and tried, without much success, to imagine what my life would look like on the other side of them. The lawyer's hands shook when he opened the envelope, and I realized with a strange, distant clarity that even the man being paid to remain neutral in this room understood exactly how much power those 2 pages held. 3 days had passed since the clinic, 3 days spent almost entirely alone in the guest wing, meals brought to me by staff too nervous to speak more than a few words at a time, the house around me humming with a tension I could feel through the walls even when I could not hear the conversations causing it. Now I sat once again in the same study where this entire nightmare began, surrounded by the same faces, waiting for a piece of paper to decide whether my life would be destroyed or simply rearranged into something unrecognizable. Margaret Voss stood at the head of the room, like a queen preparing to deliver a verdict she had already decided in her own mind. She had spent the past 3 days, I later learned, making calls, arranging contingencies, preparing exactly what she planned to do the moment this test confirmed what she desperately wanted to believe, that I was nothing more than an opportunist who had targeted her son for money and status. "Before Mr. Hargrove reads the results," she said, her voice carrying the false calm of someone who believed victory was only seconds away, "I want it understood, clearly, by everyone in this room, what happens next. When this proves the child belongs to some other man, Miss Whitfield will be removed from this house today. She will receive no severance, no recommendation, and she will be informed that if she ever attempts to associate the Voss name with this scandal again, in any way, our lawyers will make the rest of her life considerably more difficult than it already is." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, and said nothing. I had learned 3 days ago exactly how little my words mattered in this room, and I was not going to waste what little dignity I had left, arguing with a woman who had already convinced herself of a truth that did not exist. Damien stood near the window, arms crossed, his face unreadable in the way I had come to recognize as his default expression whenever his mother spoke. But I noticed something this time that I had not noticed 3 days ago. His eyes kept returning to me, brief glances he thought no one else could see. Small moments of reassurance passed silently across a room full of people who would have called it weakness if they noticed. Gerald Hargrove, the family's longtime lawyer, cleared his throat and unfolded the pages inside the envelope. The room went silent in a way that felt almost physical, every person present holding their breath at the same time, waiting for 2 pages of clinical language to determine the direction of an empire that had taken 3 generations to build. "The results confirm," he said, his voice steady, despite the visible tremor still in his hands, "with a probability exceeding 99.9%, that Damien Voss is the biological father of the child." The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had ever experienced. It was not empty. It was full, heavy, pressing down on every person in that room, like the air itself had thickened into something solid. I watched Margaret's face shift through several emotions in the span of a few seconds. Disbelief first, then something closer to fury, and finally a cold, calculating stillness that frightened me more than her anger ever had. "That's impossible," she said, though the tremor in her own voice betrayed her certainty. "The lab used 2 separate testing methods for verification," Hargrove said carefully, clearly uncomfortable being the messenger for news that was about to detonate inside this family. "There is no margin for error here, Mrs. Voss. The results are conclusive." I watched the other faces in the room, advisors and lawyers whose names I barely knew, exchanging glances that told me they were already calculating what this meant for the business, for the family's reputation, for every careful arrangement that had been built around Damien's engagement to Isabel Calloway. No one in that room, I realized, was thinking about me or the child at all. They were thinking about power, about strategy, about how quickly this truth could either be buried or turned into something useful. Damien was the first to move. He stepped away from the window and crossed the room slowly, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began 3 days ago, he stood directly beside me, instead of watching from a careful distance. "I already knew," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried enough weight to silence the murmuring that had started among the advisors. "I've known since the night my mother first suspected. I chose to let the test confirm it independently, so no one in this family could claim I manipulated the outcome." Margaret turned to him with an expression of betrayal so raw it was almost painful to witness. "You knew, and you said nothing? You let me humiliate her, drag her into that clinic like a criminal, and you said nothing?" "I let the truth speak for itself," Damien said, "because I knew you would never have believed me otherwise." The room erupted into a controlled kind of chaos after that, voices rising and overlapping, advisors already discussing damage control, Margaret's fury turning from me toward her own son with a speed that would have been satisfying if the entire situation were not so dangerous. I sat in the middle of it, still holding myself together with whatever strength I had left, watching a family I had served for 3 years tear itself apart over a truth I had never asked to reveal. This changes everything, one of the advisors said, a thin man named Edmund Price, whose eyes had never once, in 3 years, looked at me with anything resembling warmth. The Callaway alliance was built on the assumption of a clean engagement. If this becomes public before the wedding, Victor Callaway will see it as an insult. He may see it as an excuse to walk away from the peace agreement entirely. The wedding still moves forward, Margaret said sharply, some of her composure returning as she pivoted from personal fury into strategic thinking. This changes nothing about the engagement. The child can be handled quietly. Support payments, discretion, a life far from this city where it will never interfere with the family's plans. I felt something cold settle into my chest at her words, the casual way she spoke about my child, as though it were a problem to be filed away and forgotten, a loose end to be tied off with money and distance. No, Damien said, and the single word carried enough force that every conversation in the room stopped immediately. Margaret turned to him, her expression sharpening. Excuse me? I said no, Damien repeated, his voice steady now in a way I had never heard from him before, not during business calls, not during the tense negotiations I sometimes overheard through closed doors. I am not hiding my own child. I am not paying someone to disappear, so an arranged marriage can proceed as though nothing happened. Damien, Margaret said, her voice dropping into something almost pleading, a tone I did not know she was capable of. You do not understand what you are risking. This alliance took years to negotiate. Victor Callaway's organization controls ports we depend on for half our operations. If you break this engagement now, over a housekeeper and a child born outside of it, you are not just embarrassing this family, you are potentially starting a war we are not prepared to fight. The word war settled into the room like a physical weight, and I saw several of the advisors exchange uneasy glances, clearly less confident than Margaret in their ability to survive whatever conflict she was describing. I had known, in the abstract way that comes from overhearing conversations not meant for me, that the Voss family's business existed in dangerous territory, but I had never fully understood how thin the line was between peace and violence, until that exact moment, sitting in a room where my own life had just become part of the calculation. Then we prepare, Damien said simply, because I am not spending the rest of my life married to a woman I do not love, raising a child who is not mine, while my own son or daughter grows up somewhere far away, told that their father wanted nothing to do with them. I have watched this family sacrifice everything for strategy, for alliances, for appearances. I am done being one more piece moved across that board. I stared at him, stunned into silence, feeling something shift inside my chest that I had not expected, a small, fragile warmth breaking through days of fear and humiliation. I did not fully trust it yet, this sudden declaration made in front of an entire room, but I could not deny how deeply it affected me to hear him speak about our child with something that sounded, for the first time, almost like tenderness. Margaret's face went through another transformation, fury giving way to something closer to desperation. You cannot simply undo a peace agreement because of feelings, Damien. This is not a decision you are allowed to make alone. It is my decision, Damien said, because it is my life, and it is my child. You built this family on strategy, Mother. I am telling you now that strategy is going to have to include the truth for once, instead of burying it every time it becomes inconvenient. Edmund Price stepped forward carefully, his voice measured in the way of a man accustomed to navigating dangerous conversations without becoming a target himself. If I may, there may be a version of this that avoids catastrophe. If the engagement to Isabel Callaway is dissolved carefully, with the right framing, we might preserve enough goodwill to prevent immediate retaliation. But it requires precision. It requires time we may not fully control. Then we find the time, Damien said, but I am not asking permission for the decision itself. That part is already made. I watched Margaret's shoulders sink slightly, the fight draining out of her, not because she had accepted defeat, but because she recognized, perhaps for the first time in years, that her son was no longer a piece she could move according to her own plans. It should have felt like a victory, watching her lose control of a room she had dominated for 3 days. Instead, it felt like the opening of a door into a danger I was not yet prepared to understand. You are all dismissed, Damien said to the advisors, his voice final, in a way that left no room for further discussion. "I need to speak with Grace alone." The room emptied slowly, advisors and lawyers filing out with expressions ranging from concern to poorly concealed excitement at the political chaos they now had to navigate. Margaret lingered longest, her eyes moving between her son and me, with an expression I could not fully read, somewhere between fury and something that almost resembled grief, as though she were mourning a version of her son's future that had just been permanently erased. When the room finally emptied, Damien turned to me, and for the first time in 3 days, there was no audience, no advisors, no mother standing between us with accusations ready. "I meant what I said," he told me quietly, "about all of it." "Do you understand what you just did?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, still trying to process the speed at which my entire situation had shifted. "You just ended an alliance between two of the most dangerous families in this city. In front of everyone." "I know," he said. "They're not going to let this go quietly," I said, remembering Dr. Marsh's warning from 3 days ago, the careful way she had told me to protect myself, not just legally, but physically. "Victor Calloway is not going to accept an insult like this without consequences." Damien's expression darkened, and for a moment, I saw the version of him that ran an organization capable of real violence, a side of him I had glimpsed only in fragments during my 3 years in this house. "No," he agreed, "he won't. Which is why, starting today, you are not staying in the guest wing anymore. You are not staying anywhere in this house that isn't secured. This is no longer just about my mother's disapproval, Grace. This just became something far more dangerous." I felt a chill move through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. 3 days ago, I had walked into this house fearing humiliation, the loss of my job, the collapse of the quiet life I had built for myself brick by careful brick. I had never imagined that the truth of my child's parentage would become the spark that threatened to ignite a war between empires, or that the very walls I had cleaned and cared for over 3 years might soon become a battlefield I had never asked to stand in. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. Damien looked at me for a long moment, and in his eyes I saw something that had not been there 3 days ago, a kind of resolve that told me he had already accepted the danger ahead and made his choice regardless. "Now," he said, "we survive it together." I did not yet know how much that single sentence would cost either of us in the days that followed. I only knew, sitting in that quiet, emptied room, that the life I had carefully built for myself had ended the moment those 2 pages were read aloud, and whatever came next would demand a strength I was not yet certain I possessed. The first threat arrived taped to my bedroom door, a single photograph of me walking through the estate gardens, my face circled in red ink, no words attached, because none were needed. I stood in the hallway of the new wing Damien had moved me into, a section of the house with reinforced doors and guards stationed at every entrance, and stared at that photograph for a long time before I finally found the strength to knock on his study door. 2 weeks had passed since the results were read aloud in that room full of advisors, 2 weeks since Damien had ended his engagement to Isabel Calloway in front of his own mother, and in that time, the estate had transformed from a place of quiet routine into something closer to a fortress under siege. Damien opened the door before I finished knocking, as though he had been expecting exactly this moment. He took one look at my face, then at the photograph in my hand, and his expression hardened into something I had never seen on him before, a coldness that reminded me, uncomfortably, of exactly what kind of family I had become entangled with. "Where did you find this?" he asked, taking the photograph carefully, examining it, like a man, searching for a hidden meaning in every detail. "Taped to my door," I said. "No note, just this." He was quiet for a long moment, studying the image, the angle it was taken from, the location in the garden where I had walked just yesterday afternoon, alone, believing myself safe within the estate's walls. "This was taken from inside the property line," he said finally. "Whoever did this either bribed someone on staff, or they got past security without being noticed. Neither option is acceptable." "Is it Calloway?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Possibly," Damien said, "or it could be someone inside my own organization who sees this entire situation as an opportunity." I had learned, over the past 2 weeks, that the danger surrounding us was rarely as simple as one enemy acting alone. Victor Calloway had responded to the broken engagement exactly as predicted, with a formal statement calling it a grave insult to his daughter and his family's honor, though he had stopped short, so far, of any open declaration of conflict. But beneath that careful public restraint, Damien had explained to me, negotiations were already underway among the Calloway ranks about how far retaliation should extend, and whether an example needed to be made to preserve their reputation. Worse, in some ways, was the instability growing inside the Voss organization itself. Margaret had not spoken to me directly since the day of the results, but I had overheard enough hushed conversations between staff members to understand that she was working behind the scenes, meeting with advisors, trying to find some way to either reverse Damien's decision or, failing that, minimize the damage to the family's standing. Edmund Price, in particular, had become someone I trusted less with each passing day, his careful, measured suggestions always seeming to circle back toward one convenient outcome, my quiet removal from the situation entirely. "I want increased security around the guest wing tonight," Damien said, setting the photograph down on his desk, with a controlled precision that told me he was containing far more anger than his voice revealed. "And I want to know who had access to the garden yesterday afternoon." "Damien," I said, and something in my voice must have carried more fear than I intended, because he looked up immediately, his expression softening. "I'm scared, not just for myself anymore." I placed a hand over the small, still barely noticeable curve of my stomach, and I watched something shift in his eyes, a fierce protectiveness that reminded me why, despite everything, despite the danger and the chaos his decision had unleashed, I had never once regretted the truth coming out. "I know," he said, crossing the room to stand closer to me, "and I promise you, whoever is behind this will regret it." That promise, as fierce and sincere as it sounded in the moment, felt fragile against the scale of what we were facing. I had spent 3 years in this house as someone invisible, a housekeeper whose presence mattered only in the quiet efficiency of a well-run home. Now I was, whether I wanted the title or not, the mother of the Voss heir, a position that made me simultaneously more protected and more targeted than I had ever imagined possible. Over the following days, the tension inside the estate only grew heavier. Margaret finally requested a private meeting with me, the first real conversation we had shared since the day of the results, and I entered her study bracing myself for another wave of hostility. Instead, I found her sitting quietly behind her desk, her usual sharp composure replaced by something closer to exhaustion. "I am not going to pretend I am pleased with this situation," she said, gesturing for me to sit across from her. "But I have spent the last 2 weeks watching my son make a decision I cannot undo, and I have come to accept that my choices now are limited to 2 paths. I can continue fighting a battle I have already lost, or I can begin protecting this family, including the child you are carrying, from the consequences of that battle." "I didn't ask for any of this," I said quietly. "I never wanted to be part of a war between 2 families." "I know," Margaret said, and there was something almost like sincerity in her voice, the first I had heard from her directed at me since this entire ordeal began. "But you are part of it now, whether either of us wanted that outcome. And I have decided that protecting my son, and by extension, protecting his child, matters more to me than my pride." I studied her carefully, trying to determine how much of this sudden shift I could trust, remembering Dr. Marsh's warning about families like this one, and how they handled inconvenient truths. But something in Margaret's exhaustion felt genuine, the weariness of a woman who had spent decades protecting an empire, and was only now beginning to understand that some threats could not be managed through strategy alone. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Discretion," she said, "and patience. Victor Calloway is a proud man, but he is also a practical one. If we can offer him something valuable enough in exchange for accepting this broken engagement without retaliation, we may be able to avoid open conflict entirely, but it will require careful negotiation, and it will require you to remain out of public view until we understand exactly how dangerous this situation has become." I agreed, though something in the arrangement still felt precarious, built on the assumption that rational calculation would win out over wounded pride and old grudges between families who had been circling each other for generations. Over the following week, Damien and Margaret worked together in a way I had never witnessed before, coordinating with lawyers and advisors to construct an offer for Victor Calloway that might preserve peace without requiring me or my child to disappear from Damien's life. But not everyone within the Voss organization supported this careful approach. Edmund Price, in particular, grew increasingly vocal in private meetings I was not invited to but heard about through careful, worried whispers among the household staff. He believed, according to what I gathered, that the only way to guarantee the family's safety was to remove the source of the conflict entirely, meaning me, and that Damien's refusal to consider this option was placing the entire organization at unnecessary risk. I confronted Damien about it one evening, unable to shake the unease that had been building inside me for days. "Is it true?" I asked, "that Edmund wants me gone?" Damien's jaw tightened, and I saw, not for the first time, the effort it took him to remain calm in the face of threats that seemed to multiply daily. "Edmund believes in solutions that are convenient, rather than solutions that are right," he said. "But you should know that his influence in this family is not what it once was. My mother no longer trusts his judgment, and neither do I." "That doesn't mean he'll stop trying," I said. "No," Damien agreed. "It doesn't." That night, after Damien had gone to handle a series of tense phone calls with advisors working to finalize the offer for Victor Calloway, I found myself unable to sleep, the weight of everything pressing down on me with a force I had not fully allowed myself to feel until the house grew quiet. I walked to the window of my new room and looked out over the estate grounds, the same gardens I had once walked freely, now patrolled by guards whose presence reminded me constantly of exactly how much danger surrounded the child I carried. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. I opened the door expecting Damien, but instead found one of the household staff, a young man whose name I did not immediately recall, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he held out a small folded note. "This was left at the service entrance," he said quietly, "addressed to you specifically. I thought you should see it immediately, rather than wait until morning." I took the note with hands that were not entirely steady myself, and unfolded it slowly. The message inside was brief, only a handful of words, but they carried enough weight to make my blood run cold. The engagement was broken quietly. "It will not stay broken quietly. Prepare yourself." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it, but the implication was unmistakable. Whatever fragile peace Damien and Margaret were attempting to negotiate with the Calloway family, someone, somewhere, had already decided that quiet diplomacy was not going to be enough to settle this conflict. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, the note trembling slightly in my hand, and felt the full weight of everything Dr. Marsh had warned me about finally settle over me completely. This was no longer simply about a scandal, or a broken engagement, or even a fractured family struggling to accept an unexpected truth. This was about survival, for myself, for the child I carried, and for a man who had chosen, against every strategic instinct his family had built into him, to protect us both regardless of the cost. I walked immediately to Damien's study, note in hand, my heart pounding with a fear I could no longer contain quietly within myself. Whatever peace we had hoped to negotiate, whatever fragile balance his mother believed she could still achieve through careful diplomacy, I understood now, standing in that dark hallway with a threat clutched in my trembling fingers, that the storm surrounding us had only just begun to gather its full strength. Gunfire shattered the silence of the estate grounds 3 nights later, and I woke to the sound of Damien's voice shouting orders through the hallway, more urgent and more frightened than I had ever heard him. I scrambled out of bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, the small folded note from days earlier still tucked into the drawer beside my bed, as a grim reminder that the warning had not been empty. Damien burst into my room moments later, already dressed, a weapon holstered at his side that I had never once seen him carry inside the house before. "We need to move," he said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Now." "What's happening?" I asked, pulling on the first clothes I could find, my hands shaking as adrenaline flooded through me. "Calloway's people breached the east perimeter," he said. "This isn't a negotiation attempt anymore. This is retaliation." He guided me quickly through hallways that had, only days ago, felt like the safest place in the world, now filled with the sound of shouting guards and distant echoes of confrontation happening somewhere on the grounds outside. We moved toward a reinforced section of the house I had never seen before, a safe room hidden behind what appeared to be an ordinary wall panel in Damien's private study. Built, he explained hurriedly, for exactly this kind of scenario, a contingency his family had prepared for generations, but had rarely, if ever, needed to use. Margaret was already inside when we arrived, her composure remarkably intact despite the chaos unfolding around us, though I could see the tension etched into every line of her face. "The security team is containing the breach," she said, as Damien sealed the door behind us. But Victor Calloway did not send a small message. He sent enough people to make certain we understood exactly how seriously he takes this insult. "How long can we hold here?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound calm. "As long as necessary," Damien said, though the uncertainty in his own voice told me he was not entirely confident in that answer. We waited in that reinforced room for what felt like hours, though it was likely closer to 40 minutes, listening to muffled sounds from beyond the walls, unable to know with certainty whether the security team was successfully repelling the attack or whether each passing minute brought the danger closer to the door sealed in front of us. I sat with one hand pressed protectively over my stomach, praying silently for a child who had never asked to be born into the middle of a war between empires, and found myself, in that moment of fear, thinking not about the danger surrounding me, but about the strange, unexpected path that had led me here. 3 years ago, I had walked into this house believing my life would be defined by quiet, invisible service, the kind of work that let me disappear into routine and avoid the grief still lingering from my parents' deaths. I had never imagined that a single night of unexpected connection would eventually place me at the center of a conflict between two of the most dangerous organizations in the city. And yet, sitting in that hidden room, listening to Damien's steady breathing beside me, I found that I could not fully regret the path that had brought me here, even in the middle of its most terrifying chapter. Eventually, the sounds outside quieted, and a firm knock on the door, followed by a code phrase Damien had whispered to Margaret earlier, signaled that it was safe to emerge. We stepped out into a house transformed, security personnel moving through hallways with weapons still drawn, the acrid smell of smoke lingering faintly in the air from what I later learned had been a small fire started near the east wing during the confrontation. The attackers had been repelled, but not without cost. 2 of the estate's security team had been injured, though thankfully none fatally, and the breach had been severe enough that Damien's advisors were already calling it an act of open war rather than a mere warning. "This cannot continue," Margaret said the following morning, gathering the family and its closest advisors in the study, the same room where this entire ordeal had begun weeks earlier. "Victor Calloway has made his intentions clear. We either respond with equal force, which risks an extended conflict neither organization can fully survive, or we find another path forward entirely." "What other path is there?" Edmund Price asked, his voice carrying an edge of barely concealed frustration. He attacked this estate directly. Restraint at this point reads as weakness. "Restraint," Damien said firmly, "is not the same as inaction. I am not suggesting we do nothing. I am suggesting we approach this differently than simply escalating violence until one side is destroyed." He explained, over the following hour, a plan that surprised even me with its boldness. Rather than responding with force or continuing to negotiate quietly behind closed doors, Damien proposed a direct, public meeting with Victor Calloway, an opportunity to address the broken engagement honestly, in front of witnesses from both organizations, rather than allowing rumor and wounded pride to dictate the terms of an ongoing conflict. "You want to hand him the perfect opportunity to eliminate you both in one meeting," Edmund said incredulously. "I want to give him the truth," Damien said, delivered with enough respect and enough transparency that continuing this war becomes harder to justify to his own organization than accepting peace. The meeting was arranged 3 days later, held on neutral ground at Victor Calloway's insistence, a private estate outside the city where both organizations agreed to arrive with limited security as a gesture of good faith that neither side fully trusted, but both recognized as necessary if any resolution was possible. I insisted on attending, despite Damien's initial reluctance to expose me to the danger directly. If I am the reason this conflict began, I told him the night before, then I am not going to hide while you face the consequences alone. This is my life too, my child's life. He argued briefly, but eventually relented, understanding, I think, that my presence carried its own kind of power in a confrontation, built entirely around questions of truth and honesty. Victor Calloway was exactly the kind of man his reputation suggested, imposing, controlled, his eyes carrying the calculating sharpness of someone who had survived decades in a world built on danger and negotiation. Isabel stood beside him, her expression far more difficult to read than her father's, somewhere between anger and what I eventually recognized as relief. You broke an agreement that took years to build, Victor said, his voice carrying quiet menace, despite its measured tone. You embarrassed my daughter in front of every organization connected to this city. I did, Damien said, without excuse or hesitation, and I take full responsibility for the timing and the manner in which it happened. But I will not apologize for refusing to build a marriage on a lie, or for choosing to acknowledge a child that is mine. Victor's eyes shifted toward me, studying me with an intensity that made it difficult to hold my composure, though I forced myself to meet his gaze directly, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of his scrutiny. And you, he said, addressing me directly for the first time, the housekeeper who became the center of a war between empires, do you understand what your existence has cost this city? I understand, I said, my voice steadier than I expected, that I never asked for any of this. I understand that a single night, between two people who cared about each other more than anyone in either family was willing to admit, has now become a reason for violence between organizations that have nothing to do with either of us personally. And I understand that continuing this conflict will not undo what already happened. It will only create more suffering for people who had no say in any of it. Isabel spoke then, surprising everyone in the room, including, I suspected, her own father. She's right, she said quietly. Father, I never wanted this marriage, not because of anything wrong with Damien, but because it was never built on anything real. If this conflict continues in my name, it will be a war fought over an arrangement I never truly wanted for myself. Victor turned to his daughter, something shifting in his expression, a father's protectiveness colliding with decades of strategic calculation. You would have me simply accept this insult? I would have you accept the truth, Isabel said, that sometimes an arrangement fails not because of dishonor, but because it was never meant to succeed in the first place. There are other ways to secure peace between our organizations, Father, that do not require my marriage or continued violence. The negotiations that followed stretched across several more hours, careful and tense, each side working to find terms that preserved enough dignity and enough practical benefit to justify stepping back from open conflict. In the end, an agreement was reached, not the marriage alliance originally intended, but a series of business arrangements and mutual guarantees that satisfied both organizations' need for security without requiring anyone to sacrifice their personal life for the sake of strategy. As the meeting concluded and both parties began preparing to depart, Victor Calloway approached me one final time, his expression unreadable in the way of a man who had spent his entire life mastering the art of concealing his true thoughts. You have more courage than most people who have sat across from me in negotiations like this, he said. I do not offer that observation lightly. Thank you, I said, uncertain how else to respond to words from a man who, only days earlier, had sent people to attack the home I now lived in. Raise your child well, he said, before turning to leave. The world needs fewer wars built on pride, and more people willing to speak difficult truths in rooms full of powerful men, too stubborn to hear them. In the weeks that followed, the estate slowly returned to something resembling normal life, though normal now carried a different meaning than it had 3 years earlier, when I first arrived as a quiet, invisible housekeeper, hoping only to rebuild a life shattered by grief. Margaret, though still adjusting to the reality of a future she had never planned for her son, began treating me with a cautious respect that, while not warm, no longer carried the open hostility of those first difficult days. Edmund Price quietly departed the organization not long after the negotiations concluded, his influence diminished beyond recovery, once his preference for convenient solutions became too well known throughout the family. Damien and I did not rush toward any particular label for what existed between us, choosing instead to let it grow naturally from the honesty that had finally been forced into the open. What I knew for certain, standing in the gardens of the estate months later, watching the sun set over grounds that had once felt like a cage and now felt, slowly, like something closer to home, was that the truth, however dangerous it had been to reveal, had ultimately proven stronger than every lie built to contain it. My son was born on a quiet morning in early spring, and as I held him for the first time, I thought about the long path that had brought us both to this moment, from a needle forced into my arm in a room full of accusations, to a war, narrowly avoided, through nothing more than the courage to speak an inconvenient truth. He would grow up in a world of power and complexity I never fully anticipated for myself, but he would grow up knowing, without question, exactly who he was, and exactly how deeply he was wanted, by a mother who had refused to disappear quietly, and by a father who had chosen, when it mattered most, to place truth above every strategy his family had ever built its empire upon. The empire had not fallen, in the end. It had simply been forced to rebuild itself around something it had never fully valued before, an honesty too powerful to be buried, carried by a housekeeper the family had once tried to erase entirely from its story.